I had just pulled Wade down behind a cedar trunk when a rock smashed the crate beside us. "Stop shooting," I yelled, but behind me, the dry click of a bolt still snapped open. At the edge of the firelight, a Bigfoot almost 9 feet tall stepped out, its shoulders blocking the forest behind it. It held one injured arm, looked straight at us, then turned toward a smaller creature hiding behind a tree trunk. When it roared, the ground shook beneath my knees. That was when I understood we weren't being hunted. Hello, I'm Victor, and you're listening to Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories. Today's story takes us back to northern Idaho in the fall of 1994, where a deer hunting trip among 4 friends turned into a retreat through the dark. Our editorial team compiled the story from witness accounts, forums, blogs, documents, and Bigfoot research communities. We cannot verify whether this was a real event, a memory reshaped by time, or a modern legend, so listen with an open mind. If you believe the deep woods still hide something, comment "believe." And let's return to the night Harold Mercer realized who had truly invaded whose territory. On the morning of October 6, 1994, Harold "Hal" Mercer stood in front of Wade Harlan's garage before full daylight, a folded supply list tucked inside his jacket pocket. He checked every item loaded into the bed of the dark green Ford F-250. Tow rope, first aid kit, wool blankets, spare fuel can, and an old Coleman lantern. Curtis Bell stood nearby, tying down an ammunition box and laughing that Hal was preparing for a military campaign instead of an elk hunting trip. Hal bent down, tightened the straps on the truck bed, and reminded him that temperatures in northern Idaho could drop below freezing after sunset. Wade, used to his friend's caution, handed him a cup of hot coffee and said a co-worker at the machine shop had seen fresh elk sign near a creek branch east of Kelly Creek. Nolan Price spread a paper map across the hood and pointed with a pencil to an area nearly 10 miles beyond the last forest road. He explained that several old logging routes in the region had been abandoned for years and no longer appeared on newer maps. Curtis grew even more excited, lifted his Minolta camera, and declared the trip would bring back a photo of the biggest elk ever hung in his shop. Hal noticed Curtis was carrying more ammunition than necessary, but he kept the comment to himself. When the truck left Orofino and merged onto U.S. Route 12, the mood inside the cab was still light, like every earlier trip they had taken. Wade talked about his son learning auto repair. Nolan said winter might arrive early that year. Curtis kept repeating the rumor about a large elk herd moving deep in the timber. Hal sat by the window and spoke less than the others, his eyes following the low clouds pressing against the distant mountainsides. By early afternoon, they stopped in front of a small ranger station, closed for the season. A wooden sign beside the road warned that the section ahead was no longer maintained. At the foot of the sign were 3 long depressions blurred by rain. Curtis stepped out, glanced at them, and said they were probably bear tracks overlapping boot prints. Hal measured the spacing with the toe of his boot and noticed the stride was unusually long. He did not offer a conclusion. He only looked toward the forest for several seconds before returning to the truck. The road grew narrower until a fallen pine blocked a bend. Wade shut off the engine. In the silence that followed, Hal clearly heard metal contracting beneath the hood from the cold. Then he realized there wasn't a single bird calling in the forest around them. The group unloaded their gear and arranged what they needed to carry. Hal checked backpack straps, reminded Wade to hide the spare key in the magnetic box under the truck, and wrote in his notebook that they left the parking point at 12:40 p.m. Nolan aligned the compass with the old map, while Curtis joked that Hal would make them take attendance before every meal if the trip lasted a few more days. Hal told everyone to remember the direction the truck was facing, because the road behind them was partly hidden by the fallen pine as the sky sank lower with clouds. For the first 2 miles, the terrain was fairly easy, but elk sign was almost gone. Curtis kept bending down to check soft ground beside the path, then grew disappointed when he found only rotting leaves and old tracks. Wade thought the herd might have been pushed to the next slope by other hunters. Hal knelt beside a patch of mud beneath a root, touched the edge of a dry deer track, and realized it was more than a week old. This area had water, grass, and many natural trails, so the lack of fresh sign caught his attention more than any mark on the ground. The deeper they went, the fewer normal forest sounds remained. A gray squirrel ran along a pine trunk ahead, stopped to look down at them, then disappeared into the branches. After that, Hal no longer heard birds calling or small wings moving above. Several times he pretended to adjust his backpack straps so he could listen behind them. Nolan noticed and asked what he had found. Hal answered that what bothered him was not what was there, but what should have been there and wasn't. Curtis said the elk must have changed direction because of falling air pressure before the cold front. By mid-afternoon, they found a large cedar with 4 parallel scratches higher than a man's head. Curtis said a bear could stand on its hind legs and claw the bark, but Hal studied the wood and noticed the cuts moved sideways instead of downward. There was also no bear hair caught below. Nearby, 6 fist-sized stones had been placed in a straight row on a rotten log. Nolan checked the moss pressed beneath the stones and confirmed they had been moved recently. Wade called loudly toward the woods, asking if anyone was camping nearby. His voice drifted between the trees and vanished. Curtis laughed and said they had walked into some hermit's backyard. Everyone laughed with him, but the sound felt short and lonely in the quiet forest. Hal looked back at the row of stones before moving on. At that moment, the outermost stone slowly rolled off the log and dropped into the damp leaves, though no wind had passed through. By late afternoon, the group found a high patch of ground about 40 yards from a creek branch, flat enough for 2 tents, and sheltered partly by pine trunks from the wind off the eastern slope. Hal walked a full circle around the area before setting down his pack. The front of camp opened toward sparse woods. Behind it was a fern-covered slope, which meant there was only one easy direction of retreat. Light was draining quickly from the treetops, so he accepted the campsite instead of pushing everyone farther. Hal and Wade set up the tents. Curtis carried the food bag about 70 yards away and hung it from a branch to keep bears away. Nolan stretched a tarp over the firewood, then marked the camp on the map with a red circle. While collecting water from the creek, Hal saw a young branch twisted into a loop at chest height. The exposed wood inside was bright and damp, meaning it had been broken recently. He picked a similar branch and tried twisting it with both hands, but the wood only bent down. It would not make the sharp kink he was looking at. Curtis called from the water's edge, telling everyone to come look at a large pile of scat in the mud. Inside were berries, animal hair, and pieces of bark, but its size was far larger than any black bear scat Hal had ever seen. He used a stick to break the outer layer and realized the center was still slightly warm. Hal immediately ordered everyone back to camp before dark. Once the fire was steady, Wade suddenly lifted his head as a heavy odor rolled across the clearing. It smelled like wet fur mixed with sour soil and animal sweat. The smell vanished after a few seconds. Hal watched the direction of the smoke and confirmed the wind was coming down from the eastern slope, meaning the source of the odor was somewhere above them. Curtis raised the Minolta, aimed the lens into the forest, and snapped a photo. The flash revealed only tree trunks and a thin layer of mist moving between them. During dinner, a sharp knock echoed from far away, like stone striking wood. About 8 seconds later, a similar sound answered from across the creek. Hal looked at his watch, while Curtis said wood could crack when temperatures dropped. As soon as he finished speaking, 3 even knocks came from the east. Hal lowered the fire to see better into the dark. Nolan opened the map to look for another camp. Wade pulled his rifle closer to his leg. Curtis called out that they were only there to hunt elk and would leave in a few days. No human voice answered. Near midnight, during the first watch, Hal heard heavy footsteps stop outside the edge of the firelight. He swept his flashlight across the open ground. Nothing stood there, but a young alder was still trembling. Hal woke before dawn, when the fire pit held only a red glow beneath cold ash. He slowly unzipped the tent to avoid waking the others, then stopped when he saw the tin cup that had been beside a log the night before lying, near the outer edge of camp, almost 15 feet away. The cup was intact, with no bite marks and no drag marks. Hal circled the camp, crouching low to inspect the ground before waking Wade. The food bag still hung untouched in the woods. The tent lines had not been moved. The backpacks beside the tree remained exactly where they had been placed. Whatever had crossed the camp was clearly not searching for food and had been careful enough to avoid every cord. Wade crawled out of the tent and immediately saw a deep depression beside the place where he had slept. As light spread through the pines, the shape became clear. A footprint nearly 20 inches long, more than 8 inches wide with 5 distinct toes, and a heel pressed deep into mud. The print lay less than 6 feet from the tent. Curtis came over, went silent, then forced a laugh, and said someone had carried a fake foot into the woods to scare them. Hal knelt, placed his hand beside the print, and showed them how the soil was heavily compressed at the heel before shifting toward the toes. A fake mold would press evenly. This print carried the weight of a living body. The next print was more than 4 feet away. Nolan measured it, wrote the number in his notebook, and placed a matchbox beside the track so Curtis could photograph it. Hal took a small soil sample in a plastic bag and marked the nearest tree with charcoal. They followed the tracks down to the creek bank. The steps went straight across slick stones, where anyone wearing fake feet would have struggled to keep balance, then appeared again in the mud on the far side. A few yards away, Hal found a smaller track line, about 11 inches long, running beside the larger prints. His face changed when he saw it. Hal told everyone they needed to return to camp, pack up, and leave the area. Curtis objected, saying the smaller tracks proved multiple people were staging a hoax and that they should follow another half-mile to find where the props were hidden. Nolan said they already had photographs. Wade stood between the two sides, staring into the forest beyond the creek. Finally, Wade agreed to continue until noon on the condition that everyone stay close together. Hal accepted the majority decision, but ordered that no one fire unless they had a clear target and a direct threat to life. Before leaving camp, he looked up and saw a dark shape standing upright between 2 trees across the creek. Its head and body were tall and narrow, nothing like a bear standing upright. Hal blinked. The space was empty except for lightly moving branches. The track line led the group up a fern-covered slope, where damp soil held deep impressions before they vanished on gray stone. Hal walked in front, eyes moving from the ground to the tree trunks on both sides. He noticed the large tracks often appeared in soft mud, while, in dry forest floor, broken branches lay exactly in the direction of travel, as if marking movement intentionally. Nolan stopped before 3 small stone piles, each made of 3 stacked rocks, the top rock lighter in color. He measured the bearing and discovered the piles formed a curve around the high ground ahead. Curtis stepped over a fallen trunk blocking the path, but Hal grabbed his shoulder. Both ends of the trunk still held moss, meaning it had been dragged from somewhere else rather than falling there. Hal said it might be a boundary. That comment stopped Wade from laughing and made him look around longer than usual. Curtis pointed forward, where the tracks were clear in black soil, and reminded them they had agreed to continue until noon. In that trail of prints, one smaller track sat neatly inside a larger one, as if a young creature had tried to step exactly where the adult had stepped. Wade suggested turning back. Curtis wanted to check a little farther. Hal looked at his watch, then agreed to another 300 yards, as long as the group stayed tight and no one left formation. A clearing appeared beyond a strip of young pines. Many saplings had been bent in the same direction. Large bundles of branches formed low arching shelters, and several paths between them were cleaner than the forest floor around them. Beneath one branch roof, dry grass had been pressed into a wide hollow, large enough for a huge body to lie down. Nolan counted at least 4 different foot sizes. Near the edge of the clearing, an elk bone had been cracked in the middle, the marrow removed from inside. Hal felt this was not a random feeding spot. It was an area used repeatedly by a group. Curtis lifted the camera. The shutter had just clicked when a low sound came from higher in the forest. It began like a human shout in a deep register, then stretched into a heavy vibration that tightened Hal's chest. Wade lowered his rifle from his shoulder, but Hal pushed the barrel down and told everyone to stand still. A second roar answered from below the slope, near the route they had just used. Nolan turned and realized they were between 2 sound sources. At the edge of the clearing, a young tree was pulled down toward the ground, then released hard. Hal ordered everyone to retreat the way they had come. As they stepped out of the clearing, Nolan stopped before a new stone pile in the middle of the trail. On top of it was the red handkerchief Curtis believed was still in his jacket pocket. Curtis reached into his jacket pocket, then searched it a second time. His face, red from the cold, went pale as he realized the handkerchief was truly gone. The stitching around the pocket remained intact. The wooden button was still closed. He clearly remembered using the cloth to wipe his lens about 20 minutes earlier. Hal crouched before the stone pile and made everyone stand back. He studied the leaves nearby and found a large footprint outside the trail, exactly in a shadowed place where something behind brush could watch the entire group. Curtis immediately turned on Wade and asked whether he had taken the handkerchief as a joke. Wade stared at him for a few seconds, then snapped that he was busy trying to stay alive and had no interest in childish games in the middle of this forest. The argument forced Nolan to step in and tell them both to lower their voices. Hal did not want their noise covering up movement behind them. He ordered everyone to stay close, no more than 6 feet apart. Curtis was placed in the middle. Nolan took the rear to watch the ground. Wade kept his rifle pointed down. As they began withdrawing, dry branches cracked again on the right side of the slope. The sound moved parallel with them, sometimes close enough to hear leaves being pressed down, sometimes farther back behind the pines. Every time Hal raised his hand to stop, the movement stopped too. When he moved the group again, it followed the same rhythm. Nolan opened the map and pointed out a shortcut that could bring them back to camp almost half an hour faster. Hal refused because the route had not been checked and passed through dense timber. Curtis said daylight was fading fast and going the long way was more dangerous. Before Hal could answer, a small stone flew between him and Wade, landing directly in front of Curtis's boot. Hal bent down, checked it, and looked toward the direction it came from. Whoever threw it had been about 40 yards higher and accurate enough to send it between 2 human bodies without hitting either one. Curtis said it was a threat from someone hiding in the woods. But Hal understood the important part was where the stone had landed. It had blocked the entrance to the shortcut. He decided to return by the old route despite Curtis muttering that they were letting something invisible control them. The group passed through a narrow gap between 2 cedars. As Curtis stepped out of it, he heard heavy breathing close beside his shoulder. He spun around and lifted his flashlight. Behind the trunk, only a giant black hand was withdrawing, 2 long fingers disappearing slowly into the forest shade. Curtis had no explanation for what he had just seen. Curtis stood frozen beside the cedar, his rifle held low, but his trigger finger still tight. Hal stepped in, took the barrel, and pushed it down before Curtis could turn toward the darkness. He repeated the rule they had agreed on that morning. No one fired unless the target was clear and life was threatened. Curtis jerked his hand away, trying to sound calm, but his short breaths exposed the panic he was trying to hide. The group continued along the old route and stopped before 3 young trees blocking the way. That morning, this section had been open. Now the trunks lay crossed over one another like a barrier built quickly but deliberately. Hal inspected the bases. The trees had not been uprooted by wind and had not been cut. They had been broken nearly 6 feet up, then dragged together from 2 directions. Wade tried lifting one trunk, but moved it only a few inches. Nolan had to use rope while Curtis and Hal pushed the tops aside. It took almost 20 minutes to open a gap wide enough for each man to squeeze through. During that time, tree knocks kept sounding around the slope. Sometimes ahead, seconds later to the left, then farther down near the creek. As Nolan crawled past the barrier, he checked the map and compass. The knocks formed a wide arc that seemed to be pushing them southwest. That route did not lead directly back to camp, but it did lead away from the living area they had just found. Hal began to understand that whatever was watching them might be opening a way out. He suggested abandoning the old route and following the less blocked forest. Curtis objected immediately, pointing out that the tents, food, first aid kit, and most ammunition were still at camp. Wade looked at the sky and said they needed their gear before the temperature dropped. Hal reluctantly agreed, but ordered a fast withdrawal with no more stops. When Nolan stepped over the last trunk, he found a handprint clearly pressed into the damp bark. It was nearly twice the size of an adult human hand, with 5 long fingers wrapped around the trunk as if it had been pulled aside by force. Curtis stared at it for a long moment, then looked away. Higher on the slope, a short, high, raspy sound rang through the forest. Right after it, a deeper sound answered from farther east. Hal looked at Nolan. Both men understood the first sound might have belonged to a young one. They continued toward camp in silence. When the first traces of smoke appeared between treetops, Hal stopped. The thin smoke column leaned south, completely opposite the cold wind blowing into their faces. When the group was about 100 yards from camp, Hal raised a fist to stop them. The smoke ahead still leaned against the wind, then broke into low drifting strips between the pines. He and Wade moved forward, keeping their rifles pointed down, while Nolan and Curtis waited behind. Closer in, Hal realized the smoke was not coming from a new fire. The old ash in the fire pit had been stirred, as if a branch had swept through the coals repeatedly. Both tents were still standing. The food bag in the woods had not been taken, but everything in the camp carried the strange feeling of having been rearranged. Curtis's spare camera, which he had left on a wooden crate, now sat in the center of the clearing, its lens pointed straight toward the eastern forest. The coil of rope beside it had been untied and arranged into an almost perfect circle. Inside the circle were 3 pine cones and 1 white stone, brighter than the surrounding soil. Hal called the others in and told them to touch as little as possible. Nolan collected the map, compass, first aid kit, and flashlights. Wade grabbed blankets, water, and fuel. Curtis picked up the camera and checked the film counter. He froze. Before they had left camp, the counter had read 12. Now it read 13. No one admitted returning or pressing the shutter. Since the film had not been developed, they could not know what the new frame had captured. Curtis looked toward the forest, his earlier excitement replaced by caution. Nolan was rolling the map when he suddenly went still, staring across the creek. Between 2 trees on the opposite bank stood a tall figure, shoulders wider than any man Hal had ever met. The last light of day brushed its dark face and reflected in its eyes for one brief moment. Hal estimated it at more than 8 feet tall. Its arms hung almost to its knees and its body balanced naturally on 2 legs. Curtis slowly raised the camera. Before his finger touched the shutter, the figure stepped sideways behind a tree and disappeared with a quietness that defied its size. Seconds later, a large rock dropped from the opposite bank into the creek, sending water spraying up. Hal understood. That was the line. He ordered that no one cross the creek and gave them 10 minutes to gather essential gear. Curtis wanted to stay until morning to protect the film. Wade reminded him the route back to the truck had rock slopes that would be dangerous after dark. After a short discussion, everyone understood each choice carried risk. They decided to stay the night and leave before dawn. When the sun vanished behind the tree line, the first heavy footstep sounded directly behind the tent, from a place where there was no trail at all. Hal ordered everyone to lower the fire and keep only a red layer of coals bright enough to see nearby gear. He understood a large fire would turn the camp into a fixed target in darkness, and their eyes would need too long to adjust if the lantern was suddenly knocked out. Curtis argued that fire was still the most reliable protection against animals, but Hal pointed toward the forest behind the tent, where the footsteps had stopped. Wade pulled his rifle close to his knee. Nolan sat beside the map with a flashlight in hand. Less than a minute later, dry branches cracked along the slope. Another sound appeared near the creek, while lower movement continued around the food-hanging area. Hal recognized at least 3 positions shifting around the camp. The first rock landed about 12 feet from the tent, sinking into soft soil. The second hit the water crate, knocking the lid off and spilling water through the leaves. The third flew out of the dark and landed between the men, making Curtis jerk his legs back. Hal watched the locations of the throws and understood the things outside could hit them if they wanted. Their targets were the tents, water, and supplies that would let the group stay longer. Wade stood and spoke toward the forest, saying they would leave at daylight. All sound stopped for nearly 30 seconds. The silence made the men look at one another as if Wade's words were being considered somewhere beyond the light. Then a short roar came from the east, followed by the dry, heavy crack of a large branch being broken. Nolan said the creatures probably did not understand every word. Hal thought they were reading tone, posture, and the fact that the 4 men were still sitting beside their gear. Curtis suddenly saw a low shadow run between 2 trees near the creek. He switched on his flashlight, jumped up, and shouted for whoever was hiding to come out. A rock came flying and smashed the Coleman lantern on the crate. Glass spilled onto the ground. The flame burst out. Darkness swallowed the camp in a single breath. Curtis stumbled back, dropped the camera, and worked the rifle bolt. Hal rushed toward him, but from the creek came a high, raspy, frightened cry. 2 deeper roars answered from different directions, making the ground under their feet seem to tremble. Hal ordered everyone to abandon camp immediately. Nolan warned that the western slope was full of slick rock and deep cracks. Curtis tightened his grip on the rifle and said one warning shot into the air would scare everything away. Hal turned to stop him just as Wade flinched at a black shadow flashing beside the tent. The gunshot cracked violently. The bullet went straight into the sky, and the sound rolled across the entire valley. Wade's gunshot tore through the darkness, bounced across the slope, and faded between the trees. For several seconds, the forest became so silent that Hal could hear the shell casing roll on the dirt beside his knee. Then 3 roars erupted from different directions at once. The first came near the creek, the second from the slope. The last exploded directly behind the tent, so deep it shook everyone's chest. A young tree was slammed down at the edge of camp, its branches sweeping across the tarp. A large rock smashed the tool crate, sending the metal lid skidding past the coals. Hal pulled Wade to the ground, gripped his shoulder, and shouted for everyone to stop firing. Nolan crawled toward a log, clutching the map and first aid kit to his chest. Curtis reached for the rifle that had fallen beside the tent while heavy. Footsteps circled the camp too fast for human eyes to follow. Two giant black shapes crossed the dim edge of the coals. One stopped long enough for Hal to see a broad chest, long arms, and a face with a wide nose and deep eyes beneath a heavy brow. It stood upright on two legs, nothing like the bear Curtis had tried to describe. The figure lunged sideways, tore the tarp loose from its ties, and threw it into brush. Another collapsed the empty tent, then knocked the food hanger down. The food bags stayed intact, while the supplies that allowed them to remain were destroyed. Hal understood they were being forced out, but Wade kept repeating that his bullet had gone into the air. Hal had not yet calmed him when Curtis saw a large shape crouched near the creek. Behind it, a smaller figure pressed close to a tree trunk. In panic, Curtis believed the larger creature was about to charge. He lifted the rifle to his shoulder. Hal saw the movement, yelled for him to lower the barrel, and lunged across the dirt between them. Curtis pulled the trigger before Hal could reach him. The muzzle flash lit the clearing and showed the larger creature turning its body to shield the small one behind it. A roar of pain broke from its chest. It stepped back half a pace, its right hand pressing against its left shoulder, then stood fully between the small figure and the men. Curtis lowered the rifle, his face dead with realization. His bullet had grazed a creature protecting a young one. From the left side of the forest, another huge shadow charged with terrifying speed, shoulders low, arms smashing through branches. Hal barely had time to pull Curtis aside. The creature struck him away from the rifle, sending Curtis crashing into leaves several feet away. Wade grabbed Nolan and pulled him out of the charge path. When Hal lifted his head, the wounded Bigfoot stood between him and the small creature, while a deep, warning roar sounded behind him. Curtis lay on his side beside a tree, breath coming in short bursts after his right shoulder struck the ground hard. The Bigfoot that had knocked him away from the rifle stopped only for a moment, long enough for Hal to see the power in its massive body. It could have taken a few more steps and ended everything. Instead, it turned toward the rifle lying in the leaves. Hal rushed in, dragged Curtis behind a large cedar, and Wade knelt to check his deformed shoulder. Nolan held the first aid kit, eyes darting across the moving shadows around camp. A low roar came from the creek bank. Then a rock landed near Curtis's rifle, forcing Nolan to jerk back just as he tried to crawl toward it. Hal saw where the stone had landed and understood the creature was watching every move they made. He ordered everyone to stay still and signaled Wade to immobilize Curtis's arm using a rifle sling and a broken tent pole. Curtis clenched teeth, trying to stay awake, but his face changed. Each time Wade touched the dislocated shoulder. Across the clearing, a large shadow pulled down the food hanger. The food bag dropped onto the leaves, still untouched. The creature continued, tearing the tarp, shoving the water crate, and scattering essential camp equipment. Hal realized they were destroying shelter, not looking for food, or rushing the humans huddled behind the tree. Old experience made him see the encirclement as organized. One creature held the creek. One moved on the high slope. The wounded one shielded the young. The large one that attacked Curtis shifted positions around the rifles. Nolan leaned again toward Wade's Winchester. Immediately, another rock buried itself in the dirt before his hand. Hal grabbed Nolan's shoulder and pulled him back. He said the creatures had already had many chances to kill them, but every strike had been meant to separate humans from weapons. After a few seconds of hesitation, Hal removed his rifle from his shoulder, placed it on the open ground, and pushed it away with his foot. Wade followed, though his hands shook. Nolan set his hunting knife beside the rifle. Curtis weakly objected, but Hal told him to look clearly at what had just happened. When the final weapon moved out of reach, the roars around camp lowered. A Bigfoot stepped into the glow of the coals, used one foot to push Curtis's rifle into damp ash, then backed away. In the dull red light, Hal saw the wounded Bigfoot pressing a handful of leaves against its left shoulder, holding the wound with slow, deliberate movements. That image made him understand. This confrontation was following a limit that the humans had almost broken completely. Hal held both hands open in front of his chest and slowly signaled for everyone to sit low and keep their arms visible. His voice stayed even, clear, and loud enough to carry over the rustling leaves without sounding like a challenge. He said they would leave. Then he removed the hunting knife from his belt and placed it on the ground. When the blade touched the damp leaves, the footsteps in the darkness softened. Nolan looked at Hal and realized he was testing the creature's reactions with each movement. Curtis leaned against the cedar, his right arm fixed with the gunsling, breathing hard. Wade lifted a pack and tried to stand. A short roar came from the high slope. Hal told him to put the pack down. Then Hal took the lightest bag himself and stepped backward from camp. To the southwest, a large shadow shifted aside, revealing an opening between two lines of trees. Nolan checked the remaining map against the compass and realized this was the same route the stone piles and fallen trunks had been trying to guide them toward since afternoon. The creatures were holding open a corridor out. Wade said they should leave immediately, but Curtis reminded them the camera still lay near the coals, and the film might contain the only proof. Hal refused to go back for it. Curtis stared at the camera for a few seconds, then suddenly pushed himself forward with his left hand and crawled out of cover. A roar burst so close that the bark behind Hal trembled. From the edge of darkness, the tall Bigfoot stepped out and slammed one hand onto the ground in front of Curtis. Leaves and wet dirt burst into his face, but the hand stopped more than an arm's length from his body. Curtis froze, eyes wide, finally understanding the creature was warning him, not trying to injure him. Hal moved in, grabbed Curtis by the collar, and dragged him back. Then he used the toe of his boot to push the camera toward the patch of light in front of the creature, showing they would not fight over it. The Bigfoot looked down at the camera, then lifted its eyes to each man. Hal saw its deep eyes move from the gun in the ash to their empty hands. He signaled everyone to stand slowly. Wade supported Curtis. Nolan took the first aid kit, and Hal led with both palms facing outward. As they stepped into the corridor, between the trees, the roars behind them lowered into short, deep sounds. They had gone about 10 steps when Nolan touched his map pocket. He pulled the paper out and opened it under the last glow of the coals. A large section had been torn away. The missing piece was exactly the area containing the creek branch, the campsite, and the living area they had found. Hal led the group along the opening between the trees, where the leaves were less disturbed than in the surrounding forest. Wade and Nolan took turns supporting Curtis, each holding one side of his body to keep the dislocated arm from striking the trunks. Curtis tried to step in rhythm, but his breathing grew heavier, and cold sweat began running down his neck despite the falling temperature. Behind them, tree knocks came at short intervals. When the group drifted east, a knock sounded from that direction. When Hal adjusted back southwest, the sound moved farther away. He understood the creatures were still watching and keeping them on the chosen route. Nolan opened what remained of the map under a flashlight, shielded by his hand. He determined this path did not lead straight to the ford. It circled over a ridge before joining an old logging road. It was longer, but it avoided the living area and the creek they had invaded. Curtis asked whether they were being driven deeper into the forest. Wade answered that at least the creatures had allowed them to leave camp, and going back to fight for the weapons would make everything worse. After nearly half an hour, Curtis began dragging his right foot. Hal found a rock hollow large enough for everyone to sit and told Nolan to check his pulse and body temperature. They had only stopped for a few minutes when small stones began landing around the edge of the hollow, each several feet from their bodies. Wade looked up and spoke toward Vorst, explaining that Curtis was hurt, and they needed a little time before moving on. A short, deep sound answered from the high slope. Then the stones stopped falling. Hal looked at Wade. Nolan lowered his head and continued tightening the splint. The response was too precise to call coincidence. When Curtis could stand again, the group moved downhill. At a narrow mud patch, Hal found a fresh, large footprint, cloudy water still seeping into the heel. The toes pointed toward them, meaning the creature had stood there waiting and left only minutes earlier. Beside the footprint, a branch had been placed on the ground like an arrow, pointing toward a ravine on the left. Nolan hesitated because that route was not on the map. But Hal looked at the terrain and saw that it reduced the slope, making it better for an injured man. He decided to follow it. When the group reached the bottom of the ravine, the flashlight beam crossed a dead deer lying across the path. The body was intact, not eaten, but on its left side was an old, dried bullet wound. Hal stopped, realizing the obstacle before them might be another sign deliberately left for the group. Hal knelt beside the deer carcass, shone his flashlight along the left side, and touched the stiff, dried fur around the bullet wound. The animal had been dead for several days, long enough to be cold but not yet torn open by scavengers. The bullet had entered low below the shoulder and remained inside, suggesting it had run from whoever shot it before collapsing in the ravine. Nolan lifted the leaves near the hind leg and found a darkened 30-06 casing. That cartridge did not belong to any of their rifles. The detail made all four men understand they were not the first hunters to pass through this area. Hal stood and swept the light toward the roots of a fallen tree on the other side of the path. Under the exposed roots lay a piece of orange hunting fabric, several bent metal wires, and broken plastic from an old trail camera. The device had once been strapped to a tree with steel bands, but the lens had been smashed and the owner, label, was missing. Curtis looked at the pieces and thought about the camera pushed into the ashes. He said maybe these creatures had been photographed before and then hunted by people with guns. Hal did not answer right away. He was looking at round dents in a pine trunk higher than a man's head. When he brought the light closer, he realized they were old bullet holes clustered at almost 8 feet high. Someone had once stood in this ravine and fired at a target far taller than a normal human. Wade swore under his breath. Nolan bent down and picked up a small metal tag buried under moss. As he wiped mud with his sleeve, a low sound rose from the eastern woods, long at first, then breaking into shorter rhythms. It was weaker than the roars around camp, almost like a creature trying to suppress pain. Another deep sound answered from far away. Then both went silent. Curtis lowered his face as he understood. The first sound might belong to the Bigfoot he had shot. Hal looked again at the deer, the broken trail camera, and the bullet holes in the tree. The signs began forming a darker story. The Bigfoot family may have endured many intrusions before that night. Guns and cameras were tied to danger in their memory. When the group climbed out of the ravine, Nolan looked through an opening between two slopes and saw a forest road under the moonlight. He believed the truck was only about 3 miles away, and hope returned. Hal checked the compass and realized that road ran deeper into the mountains. Nolan's face fell. He bent down and picked up the metal tag he had found earlier. Beneath the mud, only 2 words were still readable: property of. Everything after that had been scraped away. After nearly an hour along the mountainside, the group reached a narrow ridge overlooking a valley covered in young pines. Clouds pulled away from the moon, leaving pale light across the wet grass. Hal was about to signal them forward when he saw movement below and immediately raised a hand for everyone to get down. Less than 30 yards away, a female Bigfoot sat with her back against a tree, both arms wrapped tightly around a young one held against her chest. The young one was about 4 feet tall, with light brown fur, a head slightly large for its body, and small hands clinging hard to the mother's shoulder. A few steps away, the wounded male Bigfoot stood guard. His left shoulder was lower than his right, one hand pressing leaves against the wound Curtis had caused. Another large individual moved along the outer perimeter, sometimes stopping to watch both the humans and the path down into the valley. Hal studied the land and understood they were standing between that family and the route to lower ground. The knocks, stone rows, blocked trees, and all the rocks thrown away from people had served one purpose from the beginning: separating the hunters from the area where the young one lived. The twisting terrain had brought both sides back together at this tight place. Curtis saw the wound on the male's shoulder and lowered his head, his face tense with pain and guilt. Wade leaned close to Hal and whispered that the creature had stood close enough to kill them at camp, but had only knocked Curtis away from the rifle. The young one made a short sound, like a call held in its throat. Immediately, the male stepped forward, using his body to hide the mother and child. He bent down, picked up a large rock in his right hand, and looked straight at the men. Hal felt his pulse hammering in his neck, but long experience told him any sudden movement could turn the standoff into disaster. He removed the rifle strap from his shoulder, slowly set the gun on the ground, and opened both hands before his chest. Wade followed first. Nolan hesitated, then placed his hunting knife beside the rifle. Curtis used his left hand to push his backup gun away, eyes lowered to the wet grass. For a long, suffocating moment, both sides remained still under moonlight. Hal saw the male Bigfoot's face clearly, heavy brow, wide nose, eyes shifting constantly from the weapons on the ground to the young one behind him. The fear and vigilance in those eyes reminded Hal of fathers standing between danger and their families. The Bigfoot slowly lowered the rock, released a short roar, and backed toward the female. The family began moving down into the valley. Hal had just started to believe the confrontation was over when a dry, sharp gunshot cracked from the lower forest. The bullet cut through the canopy. This time, it had not come from any rifle lying at their feet. The gunshot from the valley made the male Bigfoot turn instantly, pushing the female and young one down into a lower gap with his good arm. The larger perimeter individual charged toward the sound, its huge body disappearing among pines in only a few steps. Hal lay flat on the ground, one hand on Wade's shoulder, listening to the remaining echo. The shot had been short and dull, unlike their hunting rifles, as if it came from a suppressed weapon, or from farther away than he had estimated. Below, a faint red light moved between trees and then vanished. It was the kind of light used to preserve night vision without fully exposing position. Nolan leaned close and said someone was moving below them. Curtis lay against Wade, his face tightened by shoulder pain, but he still tried to look toward the shot. Hal considered calling out, then stopped when he remembered the bullet had been aimed at the Bigfoot family. A furious roar burst from the lower woods. Then 2 more shots followed. A short human scream rang between the rock slopes and cut off suddenly. After that came only branches breaking, fast footsteps, and a heavy silence. Wade wanted to leave the ridge before the people below moved upward. Nolan agreed, but Curtis was shaking badly, his lips pale, and his right arm swollen beneath the sling. Hal knew they needed lower ground and shelter from the wind while keeping distance from both sides of the conflict. When Nolan pulled a civilian radio from his pack, he suggested calling rescue with their approximate position. Hal stopped him and said the signal might bring the gunmen before any rescue team. Nolan kept the radio in hand, worried Curtis would worsen if they walked for hours. The argument ended when the device suddenly crackled. A moment later, a calm male voice came through the speaker, clear enough for all 4 men to hear. The man gave no name and no agency. He simply said the group of 4 men on the ridge needed to stay where they were. Hal looked at Nolan, then down into the dark valley. none of them had ever broadcast the number of people in the group. That meant the man speaking had been watching them for some time. Below, the red light flashed again and stopped on a tree trunk, as if confirming coordinates. Hal understood the threat was not the creature in the woods. A group of men was watching the area, and they knew exactly what had happened. The voice on the radio repeated the order to stay in place, calm enough to make Hal even more cautious. He picked up the device and asked what agency the man belonged to and how he knew there were 4 of them. After a few seconds of static, the man said they were conducting dangerous animal management operations in the area. He ordered the group to put down their weapons and turn on lights so their position could be identified. Nolan pointed to the radio. Their device used a civilian frequency, which meant the man had to be close enough to catch the signal or had been monitoring them beforehand. Hal asked directly whether the group below had just fired at a large creature. The line stayed silent longer than normal, then denied it in one sentence. The delay was enough. Hal knew the man was choosing words, not reporting truth. Curtis leaned against a tree, pale with pain, and urged them to cooperate. He said they needed medicine, a stretcher, and a way off the mountain before his arm became worse. Wade argued that a real rescue team would ask about injuries, coordinates, and who could walk, not order them to stand still in a place where shots had just been fired. The radio voice hardened. It warned that any movement could cause them to be misidentified as targets. Hal heard the threat beneath the professional wording. He removed the battery, put it and the radio into separate pockets, and signaled, "Everyone west." Curtis protested, saying Hal was refusing their only chance at medical help. Hal crouched close and told him the man on the radio knew there were 4 of them, but never asked who was hurt. That made Hal believe they cared more about what the group had seen than whether any of them lived. Wade slipped an arm under Curtis's good shoulder. Nolan moved ahead to find less rocky ground. The group advanced through darkness, using the flashlight only when necessary and shielding the beam with a hand. Behind them, Bigfoot footsteps had vanished. In their place came steady boots, straps brushing clothing, and metal touching branches. Curtis stopped talking, but anger remained in the way. He avoided Hal's eyes. After about 10 minutes, Nolan stopped under a rock ledge, checked his jacket pocket, and pulled out a small film roll. He turned to Curtis. Curtis admitted he had removed it from the camera before leaving camp because he was afraid Hal would abandon the only proof. In that moment, all of them understood the men behind them might be looking for exactly what Nolan held. Nolan held the film roll in his palm, while Hal listened to footsteps pushing closer through the woods. Curtis admitted he had taken the film from the camera just before leaving camp and hidden it in his pocket because he feared the others would leave the evidence behind. The confession made Wade look at him with anger. Since the beginning of the trip, Curtis's curiosity had repeatedly pushed them deeper into danger. Now that little object might turn all 4 men into targets for armed strangers. Nolan suggested hiding the film under a rock, marking the coordinates, and coming back later. Curtis immediately objected. He said if they left it behind, everything they had seen would become a drunk story told at a bar. Wade answered that their lives mattered more than undeveloped pictures. The argument nearly erupted until Hal forced all 3 men to lower their voices. He took the film from Nolan and slipped it into the inner pocket of his jacket. He said they would decide later after putting distance between themselves and the pursuers. A red beam swept across the rock above them, forcing everyone flat to the ground. 2 dark-clothed men appeared along the upper edge of the slope, moving slowly and in coordination. They wore knit caps, carried long guns and shoulder radios, but no ranger or police patches. One stopped and spoke softly into his radio, saying the wounded adult male was moving with a family unit toward the south. The phrase chilled Hal. These people knew exactly which creature had been shot. They knew it was with a mate and young one. They spoke of them like targets that had been tracked for a long time. The other man answered that the civilian group still had material that needed to be recovered. Hal looked at Curtis, then at the film in his jacket. The pictures of tracks, the living area, and frame 13 might be what they were hunting for. When the two men above moved on, Hal signaled the group to crawl through a narrow rock crack on the left. Curtis had to pull himself with his good arm, while Wade protected his injured shoulder from the wall. Nolan went last, pushing the first aid kit through the gap. They were almost out when the ammunition box in Curtis's pocket slipped and struck stone with a dry metallic clack. The red light swung back immediately. A man's voice sounded from above, ordering the other to circle down and block the exit. Hal pulled Curtis behind a rock as footsteps split in two directions. Through the radio, he heard the final order clearly. Keep the four men alive, but find the film before they leave the area. Nolan led the group along the rock crack until the terrain opened before an old wooden bridge over a deep trench. The bridge had once served logging crews, but many boards were rotten. The right rail leaned outward, and the cables were covered in rust. Hal stepped onto it first, shifting his weight slowly to test it. The boards groaned beneath his boots, but they held one person moving carefully. He turned back and said they would get Curtis across between Wade and Nolan, while Hal went last to maintain distance from the men following them. The red light behind them had moved closer, slipping between trees and vanishing whenever the terrain changed. Wade put one arm around Curtis's back. Nolan held his good arm. The three stepped onto the bridge carefully. Curtis clenched his teeth each time a board shook, his breathing broken by pain. Hal had just reached the center when a shot cracked behind him. The bullet struck wood beside his pant leg, sending splinters into the dark trench below. A man shouted for the group to stop and place the film on the bridge. Hal looked at the three men ahead and understood that turning back meant handing them to people who had watched the entire encounter. He kept backing toward the far side, then used his knife to cut an old secondary rope connecting the final boards to a wooden post. When the rope snapped, several boards collapsed behind them, leaving a gap wide enough to stop the pursuers from crossing. The group reached the opposite side, but that choice also destroyed their way back. Curtis dropped to his knees as soon as he touched ground. His shoulder was swollen beneath his jacket, his skin cold and pale. Hal knew they had to reach the truck before dawn. Nolan opened the remaining map and determined the logging road was about 4 miles away, but the shortest path was blocked by an old landslide. Wade asked whether they could follow the rock edge. Nolan said it was too narrow to support Curtis. Behind the bridge, red lights gathered between the trees. Just as the pursuers began looking for a way around the trench, a powerful roar came from the mountain. Then came running feet, shouted orders, and 3 shots in quick succession. The red lights scattered, then disappeared one by one. Hal realized the Bigfoot had returned to the conflict zone, even though their family could have continued retreating into the forest. He did not know whether they were protecting territory, protecting the young, or accidentally helping the 4 men escape. When all gunfire behind them stopped, a large shadow stepped out along the edge of the landslide ahead. The wounded male Bigfoot blocked the only route, left shoulder hanging low, eyes fixed on the rifle still strapped to Hal. The male Bigfoot stood about 20 feet from Hal, its massive body nearly filling the landslide edge. Its left shoulder hung low. Its right hand pressed dark, wet leaves over the wound. Hal looked at the creature, then at the rifle, still on his shoulder. He understood the creature's eyes were locked on the object that had caused all of this. Hal slowly removed the sling, placed the rifle on the ground, and stepped back. Wade followed. Nolan lowered his rifle toward the leaves. Curtis leaned against a tree, his face pale as he realized. The wounded Bigfoot was the same one that had stood before the young one. Hal took the film from his jacket and placed it beside the rifle to show they no longer held the thing that could bring more danger to the creature's family. The Bigfoot stepped forward, bent down, sniffed the small canister, then lifted its head and looked at Hal. It did not touch the film. After a long, tense moment, the creature turned toward the edge of the landslide, moved along a narrow strip of soil hidden by fallen trees, then stopped and looked back. Nolan whispered that maybe it was coincidence. But behind the bridge, the red lights had returned. Hal decided to follow. There was no safer option left. Wade and Nolan supported Curtis. Hal went last, watching both Bigfoot and the pursuit behind them. The strip of ground was barely wide enough for one person. It ran beneath a rock wall, then dropped into a dry creek bed. Fallen trunks lay above it at angles, making the path almost invisible from the bridge. The Bigfoot moved ahead at a slower pace, stopping several times to check whether the humans could keep up. When a high call sounded from deep in the forest, it turned immediately. Hal understood the female and young one were waiting somewhere beyond the valley. The creature was still standing between them and the gunmen, even wounded. Before descending into the creek bed, Hal picked up the film roll. He opened the canister, pulled out the core, and hid it beneath the bandage around Curtis's injured arm. He placed the empty canister beside the rifle as bait. Curtis looked at Hal but did not object. After everything that had happened, he understood. The evidence was both a chance to prove the truth and the reason they were being hunted. The group continued down into the ravine. The male Bigfoot stood on the ridge, watching them. When Hal looked back one last time, the creature had vanished into the forest. They had gone only a few dozen yards when metal clicked above. A man's voice said clearly over the radio that the film canister had been left behind, but the film core was still with the four men. Hal tightened his hand around his pack strap and understood his misdirection had failed. Hal led the group quickly along the dry creek bed, where loose stones slid under every step. Nolan kept checking the compass against the remaining map and determined the creek would intersect an old logging route about 1.5 miles from the ford. The distance sounded short, but Curtis was starting to lose consciousness. His head sagged against Wade's shoulder. His breathing was shallow and cold. Hal and Wade had to take turns carrying him to keep moving. Behind them, red lights appeared on the high slope and vanished again, showing that the pursuers were still following and splitting formation to find a way down. Hal ordered everyone to limit talking, because one loud call could reveal their exact position in the narrow creek bed. From the forest above, 3 tree knocks rang out in sequence. A moment later, 2 replies came farther south. The sounds moved behind the gunmen, making the red lights slow and change direction several times. When a large rock suddenly rolled down the slope, it stopped in the pursuers' path and forced them to spread out. Hal understood the Bigfoot family was interfering in a quiet way, using sound and terrain to pull attention away from the 4 men. Around 3 a.m., the creek bed opened onto a weed-covered dirt road. Nolan recognized old tire marks and led them toward the parking area. The Ford appeared beneath the trees, but the driver's door was open. Wade lowered Curtis beside the rear tire and checked the main key in his pocket. It was still there. Hal immediately looked under the truck and saw that the magnetic box with the spare key was gone. Inside the cab, the glove compartment had been pulled open. The spare map, hunting permits, and backup film rolls were missing. The ignition wires under the dash had been pulled from their connector. The other men had arrived first, searched the truck, and prepared to trap them in the woods. Nolan crawled under the steering column and used a small knife and electrical tape from the toolkit to reconnect of the wires. Hal stood outside, listening to footsteps approaching through leaves. Wade kept Curtis awake by calling his name and forcing him to answer simple questions. After several tries, the engine coughed, then died. The first red light appeared between two pines less than 100 yards from the parking area. Hal saw two more figures split to the sides of the road, silently closing the circle as if they knew every exit around the lot. Nolan twisted the connection again. Wade pumped the gas. The engine finally roared to life. Just as Hal opened the passenger door, a dark-clothed man stepped into the road, raised a long gun, and aimed straight at the windshield. The man in the road held his weapon at shoulder height, the headlights, revealing a black jacket with no visible patch. Hal, now in the passenger seat, lifted both hands away from the dashboard. Wade kept his foot on the pedal, but did not dare shift into gear. The stranger ordered them to shut off the engine, keep their hands visible, and surrender the film, camera, soil samples, and maps they had collected in the forest. His voice was calm, like someone who had repeated the order many times. Hal asked what agency he represented. The man replied only that the area contained a dangerous wounded bear, and that the hunters had to be inspected before leaving. Hal stared through the windshield and asked why his people had called. That bear, an adult male and part of a family unit. The question made the commander fall silent for one beat. Then he ordered Hal to stop asking questions. In the back seat, Curtis groaned from his swollen shoulder. Wade demanded that they call an ambulance. The commander said medical assistance would be provided after all. Materials were handed over. That answer told Hal the film mattered more to them than Curtis's condition. Hal took the empty film canister from his pocket, opened the door slightly, and tossed it onto the road. An agent from the tree line stepped forward, picked it up, opened it, and reported that the core was not inside. The commander's calm expression vanished. He ordered each of them out of the vehicle to be searched. Curtis told Hal to hand over the film. Nolan held his shoulder and reminded him these men had cut the ignition wires, searched the truck, and fired warnings on the bridge. Hal was still weighing the choice when a deep roar sounded close to the forest on the right. All three armed men turned at once. A tree fell behind them, blocking the road and throwing dust into the headlights. From between the pines stepped the gray-shouldered male Bigfoot. Its left arm hung low from the wound, but its body stood tall and steady. It did not move toward the ford. Its eyes stayed on the weapons pointed toward the forest, pulling attention away from Hal's group. The commander lowered his voice and ordered the men to lock onto the target. Hal realized if Wade drove away now, the Bigfoot would remain in front of three guns. He slammed his hand onto the horn, held the sound down, switched the headlights to full brightness, and shouted toward the creature, hoping it understood it had to get out of the line of fire. The light and noise disrupted the formation outside. The Bigfoot roared and charged across the road with violent speed. All three guns swung after its shadow. Hal turned to Wade and yelled for him to hit the gas. The Ford lurched forward as the Bigfoot vanished behind a wall of trees in the freezing night. The Ford lunged through the gap between the armed men, rear tires throwing wet dirt against the body before Wade regained control. Hal twisted to look through the back window and saw red lights scatter into the woods after the gray-shouldered Bigfoot. One shot cracked, then another, but the trees hid everything. He did not know whether either bullet hit. He did not dare ask Wade to stop. Curtis lay sideways in the back seat, his head on Nolan's shoulder, lips pale but still conscious. The logging road was narrow and rutted, making the truck bounce hard. Each jolt drew a groan from Curtis, and Wade had to grip the wheel with both hands, despite pain in his ribs from the camp attack. Behind them, another vehicle's lights appeared through the bends. The distance closed fast. Nolan opened the map and told Wade to keep south until they reached the fork to US, Route 12. Hal checked the mirror and realized the pursuers had not fired at the truck. The road was too narrow, and the four men inside were witnesses they wanted alive. At a sharp bend, Wade hit the brakes because rocks and fallen trees blocked the road ahead. Hal jumped out to inspect, and saw the obstacle had been stacked to one side, hiding an old grass-covered spur road. The branch arrangement matched the signs around the living area. The Bigfoot family had marked the side route before the men arrived. Wade steered downhill, the tires sliding near the road edge before catching soft soil. The pursuing vehicle overshot the turn, giving them more distance. At the next bend, Hal looked up the slope and saw the female Bigfoot standing between two pines. The young one pressed close to her leg, its small face turned down toward the Ford passing below. The gray-shouldered male was nowhere in sight. Hal stared at the forest behind them, wondering whether the creature was still distracting the gunman or had fallen somewhere in the dark. Near dawn, the side road joined the main route. A logging truck heading toward Orofino was forced to stop when Wade pulled halfway across the lane. The driver saw Curtis's condition and used the radio to call county police and an ambulance. The pursuers' lights appeared on the slope, stopped when they saw the logging truck and another witness, then turned back into the woods. Curtis was loaded into the ambulance with a dislocated shoulder, 2 cracked ribs, and signs of hypothermia. Wade was badly bruised. Nolan had only scratches. Hal stood beside the road with hands shaking so badly he could not button his own jacket. Before the ambulance doors closed, Curtis grabbed Hal's wrist and whispered that the film core was still under the bandage around his injured arm. At the hospital in Orofino, Hal, Wade, and Nolan were separated for statements while Curtis was taken in to have his shoulder reset. A young county officer sat across from Hal, writing down the 20-inch footprints, tree knocks, destroyed camp, and creatures moving on 2 legs. When Hal described the male Bigfoot standing in front of the young one, the officer stopped writing and asked again, about distance, height, and moonlight direction. That made Hal believe the man was truly listening. Wade and Nolan were questioned in separate rooms, but their accounts matched on the number of creatures, the shots, and the dark-clothed men in the forest. Less than an hour later, 2 men in dark suits entered the hallway and showed federal credentials too quickly for Hal to read the agency name. They said the incident involved dangerous animal management and demanded the guns, camera, maps, soil samples, fur-contaminated clothing, and film for examination. Hal asked how they knew about those items, but the older man only placed a non-disclosure agreement in front of him and explained that the area involved federal security. As Hal signed, he realized the man knew Curtis had hit the creature's left shoulder and even mentioned frame 13, a detail that had never appeared in their statements. Hal asked whether the gray-shouldered Bigfoot was still alive. The man looked at him and said no creature matching that description existed in any file. When Curtis woke after sedation, the bandage on his arm had been replaced. Hal checked the edge and saw the hidden film core was gone. Curtis looked at him and understood, but neither man spoke because a nurse and a suited man still stood near the door. By afternoon, the preliminary report had been changed. It said several black bears approached the camp. The hunters panicked, fired, and injured themselves during retreat. The young officer who had listened to Hal avoided his eyes when he brought the new paper. The Ford was returned after 3 days. The cab was unusually clean. Mud, hair, handprints, and the smell of forest soil had vanished. The spare key was back in the magnetic box under the truck, exactly where Wade had hidden it before the trip. The rifles were returned later, but the camera, maps, soil samples, and film were held indefinitely. 1 week later, Hal received his jacket from the county office. When he reached into the inner pocket, he touched something round, cold, and smooth. It was a white stone, just like the stones placed at the boundaries in the forest. Hal stood in the parking lot for a long time, wondering who had placed it in his pocket, and how it had passed through the evidence process controlled by the federal men. After that night in the forest, the 4 men stayed in contact, but their friendship never felt light again. Wade, feared losing his job if the story spread, and he was labeled insane. Nolan worried his professional license and reputation would collapse over a story the authorities had denied. Curtis carried the heaviest guilt. Whenever he saw Hal, he remembered the young Bigfoot clinging to its mother, while the male stood in front of them. Later, Curtis sold his hunting supply shop and left Idaho. Before leaving, he said what haunted him was not the blow that dislocated his shoulder. It was the look in the young one's eyes after the shot. Hal understood that confession because he carried his own unanswered question about the gray-shouldered Bigfoot. From the fall of 1994 onward, Hal gave up hunting large animals. He still returned to familiar forests, but his pack carried a camera, first aid, supplies, water, and survival gear. Whenever he saw neat rows of stones, branches bent in one direction, or a patch of forest suddenly falling silent, he changed route immediately. About 10 years later, Hal returned to a lookout many miles from the old camp. That afternoon, 3 knocks sounded from the east. 2 answering knocks came from across the slope. He stood still for a long time, then returned to his truck without trying to find the source. In 2012, Nolan sent Hal a copy of a new forestry map. The Creek Branch area where they had once camped was marked as restricted for habitat recovery. There was no explanation of duration, protected species, or responsible agency. Nolan died a few years later without ever making his account public. Wade and Curtis also passed away over time, leaving Hal as the last man able to tell the whole story. When he was in his 70s, Hal decided to record it, not to convince anyone that Bigfoot existed, but to warn people who treated the wild forest as a place without boundaries. Hal remembered clearly that those creatures had enough strength to kill all 4 men in moments. Instead, they repeatedly threw rocks away from bodies, destroyed tents instead of attacking people, and opened a corridor of retreat when the guns were placed down. The tragedy began when humans ignored the rows of stones, the small footprints, and the warnings, then turned curiosity into a gunshot. On his final return, Hal brought the white stone that had stayed in his pocket for decades back near the old boundary. He placed it on a log, stepped back toward his truck, and stopped when the first knock sounded from the forest. The second came a few seconds later, deeper and closer. Hal did not turn around. All the way home, he kept wondering whether the gray-shouldered Bigfoot had survived that night. But what kept him awake was never only the possibility that the creature still lived somewhere in northern Idaho. What haunted him was that after humans had invaded, chased, and wounded him, he still chose to show 4 strangers a path out alive.